Hey everyone, it's Horror Free for All, and I hope you're doing well today. I have here a novel review of a short-lived two-novel series that came out in 2020 and I think ended in 2022. It was done by Ellie Cooper for the Creepshow franchise, and I have here the first book, The Taker. Now, The Taker and The Cursed are this very short-lived two-novel series done by Ellie Cooper, like I said, between 2020 and 2022. And I'm assuming that because they only did two novels, or maybe they only planned it, they were kind of soft launching the idea of making a Creepshow kids horror / middle grade horror spinoff, which ultimately hasn't done much. And these are relatively not talked about on the internet, sadly. And I've kind of put these off towards the end of the Creepshow franchise for me. I have put these aside and wanted to save them for a rainy day to do them last. I know at the time of me making this video, Creepshow Volume 3 from Image Comics is still releasing. I've already read the first 2 issues. I'm waiting for the next 3 and I think the holiday special before I make my thoughts on that. Because I want to do, after Volume 3 of that Image Comics run that's currently going on, an entire Creepshow franchise ranking. And this covers the movies, the TV show, the comics, and even the obscure stuff that people don't really know about. And yeah, so because I'm kind of planting my flag on some unventured territory, in case you come across The Taker out there in your Books A Million or Barnes & Noble, I'd say that this wasn't that bad of a book. You know, I didn't have high expectations. I never have read anything by Ellie Cooper, but reading into the background of how these books came to be, from what limited knowledge is out there about them, it seems like Ellie Cooper wanted to do a kids horror series and kind of instrumentalized the Creepshow franchise to be able to get this done. And in this book, it features 2 stories that are Creepshow for kids. One is called The Taker, as the title of the book suggests, and the second story is called Pretty Polly. Now, I have to say, I did like one other story a bit more than the other, but we'll get into that. But yeah, this isn't a total waste of time. But I would honestly say that after reading this, and after I've already casually read The Curse, the second book, years ago when it came out, knowing what I remember from that book and knowing what I just read for this one, I'd much rather have seen a kids horror spin-off anthology movie, maybe with these stories in it. Possibly could have been better. Could have been a huge gamble and a risk to put out a PG-13 Creepshow film. I think people would have been pissed off that that's the direction they're going. But if they made it well known that this is for kids and this is a spinoff and they put it on Shudder or something, who knows what this thing could have done. And instead, we have these obscure novels to talk about instead, which technically isn't too terrible, but it's kind of sad because I was hoping for this series to kind of take off and see maybe other writers contribute to it. But who knows? Maybe Creepshow has a chance to come back at some point in novel form. We just haven't seen it yet. So with that out the way, let's get into the book here. So in this book, there's 2, I guess, novellas put together. They're both around 70-ish pages and run about 9 to 10 chapters. The first story is The Taker, and the second story is Pretty Polly. So the first story, The Taker, is about this girl named Beatrice who goes by B. Her and her family move into this old mansion, and she has to, you know, kind of up and leave her old life and start anew. And she's really into dancing, and she's looking forward to trying out for her middle school dance team and all of that. But when they first arrive to the house, they realize that they don't have much food and they don't have much else to do. So B and her, I think, younger brother decide to go pick out some rooms. And B finds this room in the house. It's, you know, kind of isolated from the other rooms. And it's much colder than all the other rooms in the house. And it has this weird smell of grape bubblegum. And she doesn't know why, but when she finds the room, she realizes that, hey, this is probably the most expansive room I can get. That's not my parents' master bedroom. So she decides to take up the idea of moving into this colder room. And almost immediately in the story, it does take a while to click on, she meets these dance girls at her school who are kind of like a Mean Girls clique, and they're fucking awful. And they're really mean, nasty girls. And they're talking about this goth girl and how they put her down, and how she's being excluded from the dance team tryouts because of the way she looks. But B is being kind of initiated into their clique because she kind of looks like them, fits the part, and is willing to kind of play mean. Well, as the story goes along, B starts to notice in her home life, as she's making these new friends, quote unquote, that stuff is going missing in her room, like a pair of pearl earrings, and her brother has some trading cards that go missing as well. And she's trying to get to the bottom of it. And one day, she realizes that there is a box in the back of her closet, and it's this very old shoe box, and she doesn't know quite what it is, but when she opens it up, she finds her earrings in there, she finds her brother's trading cards, and I think another thing that went missing. So she's like, well, something has been taking these things and putting them there. I don't know who it is. It might be my little brother trying to stash it and frame me for something. But when she digs deep into the situation, she realizes that her brother's not involved. Well, one night, as she's in the middle of a sleep, she's awoken by a noise, and she sees a girl in her room wearing, an 80s aesthetic type of outfit. She has like a pink and, pink striped sweater, and, has 80s hair going on. And she's talking to this girl, and very quickly she realizes that the girl is essentially admitting that she's dead and that she's a ghost, and she can't leave the house, she can't leave the room, she doesn't have anybody to talk to. And very quickly, B is like, well, I don't really have a real friend to be honest with, so maybe, we can be friends. But as this friendship starts to blossom in the story, it quickly becomes a nuisance for B because she realizes how annoying and attention-seeking this ghost girl is. And the ghost girl, despite B asking her to stop taking things without permission, is not listening. She pretty much is forced to deal with it. Well, this culminates into a slumber party one night where B is essentially thrusted into a situation with one of her new friends, quote unquote, that are actually alive. And this pertains the ghost and what this ghost tries to do to her new friend. And this results in B telling her friend to go home. It's not safe to be in her room. And then when B confronts the ghost, we learn of possibly a sinister plan to be taken and what's going to happen to B moving forward. And there's a twist ending involving what's going to become of her. So yeah, that's the first story. Then it leads into the second story called Pretty Polly, which I think both of the stories, as it says on the back of the book, is supposed to be about two chilling tales of how one's deepest desires can quickly become one's greatest fears. So this one is kind of playing on a similar parallel as B. In the first story, she wanted to be a part of the dance team and wanted to fit in, but found herself making friends, I guess, with the wrong people and even the wrong entity. So this story is about a boy named Casey, who is a only child. He has a single mom who works basically a few jobs to make up for the lack of income because his dad's a piece of shit and doesn't pay child support, and has made a bunch of empty promises to Casey in his life about, taking him to the zoo and being interested in his nerdy side, because Casey's really into like Animal Planet and zoology and wants to be an animal doctor when he grows up. But his dad, he's just a man child, and he's into hanging out with his friends, watching football, drinking, and holding, crappy jobs. Well, when the story begins, we get to see Casey, he has a few rats as pets. He also has, I think, a few frogs as well that he calls his friends. And he even has a neighbor friend who, is kind of interested in what he has to talk about and maybe what he's interested in as well. That comes in and out of the story. But Casey, he really wants a parrot, but specifically a particular species of parrot known as the gray African parrot, which can live a very long time. And he notices that his pets that he has have short shelf lives, right? They're only going to live a few years. And he thinks that a parrot would be a good pet because it can last pretty much most of his life, or last a very long time, so he doesn't have to get emotionally attached just to have them die and leave. And I guess this is supposed to be a parallel to how he feels about his relationship with his dad, who he's really depicted as not being too mindful of his father. because he knows and expects him to be shitty to him, which is kind of sad, but this is kind of a stark juxtaposition. And after his dad, abandons him one day, and comes 7 hours late and he's already eaten dinner, his dad kind of finishes over his dinner, which he was going to save for later, and has to dip before his mom leaves. He looks into possibly looking for a long-term pet and finds an opportunity to get one of these gray African parrots for absolutely free. He meets up with this old man after he convinces his mom that this ad could be real. And the old man meets him in like a public library parking lot and says that, hey, this parrot, I've had him for 10 years. He's very lovable. I'm not looking for money for him. I know he can be an expensive bird that could run about $1,000, but I'm more interested in making sure that he has a good home. And the parrot seems to like Casey and his mom to the point where he feels comfortable just giving the parrot over to them. And very quickly, once Casey takes the parrot home, he realizes that the parrot might be way smarter than what he lets on to be, or what people think this species could be. And as the story goes along, he starts to notice that his parrot has a disdain for not only his two pet rats, which play a role in the story later on, but also his father. And the parrot can finish sentences and can actually answer questions and contribute to conversations. And this prompts Casey to think about the idea that maybe his new parrot is way smarter than what he actually believes. And then once his two rats essentially go missing in the story, and this breaks his heart, he has a suspicion about his parrot, so he starts to dig into the background. He starts to interrogate the guy that he got the parrot from, which leads him to another owner before that, and then leads him to another origin story beyond that. So he learns how long this parrot has actually been around, and he may or may not confront the parrot about it, and he might get his answers that way. And this plays into the climax after he learns this information, and he having mixed feelings about it all. His dad has a big argument with his mom, which of course enrages the parrot, who, as we get to know in the story, possibly is more sentient than what is led on. And we find out something that happens to the parrot and the father and Casey and his mother. And this plays a role near the end of the story where we get caught up on the situation and realize what this actually means for Casey and all. So that in a nutshell is what you're going to expect out of the second story, Pretty Polly. So for the review purpose here, I guess I'll start off with the first one, which is The Taker. I thought that this one was just a decent story. To me, when you have a 70 to 90 page story, I think this first one was a bit longer than the other one. Clocking in around 90 pages. I think that's kind of the average for these stories in both books. That if you find The Taker or The Curse, expect that kind of reading. But as you can tell, this book is pretty long, so there's a lot of text on each page. In the first story, it takes forever, and I mean forever, to click on to the Ghost Girl stuff I mentioned in the plot overview. Literally, the first half of this story is just a mean-spirited, catty story with just a bunch of meaningless dialogue and banter, and not even an engaging mystery to be had. But once that second half clicks on, it becomes kind of a warped, fucked up version of what I consider like a Haunting Hour episode, where you get like this possessive friend type who kind of wants to be the only person in your life. It reminds me of this underrated movie from the 2000s called Swim Fan, and this obsessive girl who pines over Jesse Bradford's character. That's what this Ghost Girl kind of reminds me of. Too bad the story doesn't really flesh that aspect out the best, but I do like the buildup in the story, and I do think there's some creepy utilizations of the Ghost Girl and a tragic backstory nonetheless. But then again, there's not a lot of that to be had. And to be honest, the tone of the ending for the main character, while I do think that she kind of deserved what happens to her, I do think that, it's a little too mean given the circumstances. And yeah, it's just, if this was possibly turned into an episode or maybe a movie segment. This might have been able to be salvaged if the performances were good and maybe there was more utilization of tension or atmosphere building, making it creepy or, anything of that nature. But unfortunately, the writing of this story in particular was not that good. And when you're dealing with a novel, Prouse writing matters. And this wasn't all there. And yeah, the characters aren't that likable. It seems a little bit too generic. And to be honest, you don't really see the twist coming, but you definitely see the angle with the possessive friend coming from a mile away. So it made the story just kind of a shoulder shrug. I gave this one about a 3 out of 5 stars. It's by far not the worst thing in Creepshow I've ever come across, but it's, pretty weak, and it's might be in like the bottom 25 of the entire franchise for me. Now, the second story, Pretty Polly. This one did kind of drag its ass like the former story, The Taker, but unlike that one, I think Casey was a way better character than B. I liked his story, even though it can be kind of cliche and cookie cutter about a kid living with a single mom and has a piece of shit dad. This is a very Y2K nihilist kind of story here, and I don't know if Ellie Cooper was kind of pulling on that a bit, but you saw this trope done a whole lot in the 2000s. It's kind of like the inversion of the single dad with the dead mom of the 90s. But I like Casey's, journey in the story dealing with this parrot, and I think that the parrot is a bit more of a fun way to incorporate a monster into a kid's horror story, because there's a lot of gray areas with it and some intrigue, like how old is this parrot? What exactly does it want to do? What exactly is its intentions? And I feel like there's multiple answers, but the ones that you want the most don't really get the most emphasis in the story. And I think that's what kind of holds it back, is that if you're going to be, a creature feature type of story, which I kindly, give that adjective to this, and I use that very generously here, because it's not really a creature feature. It's more of like a kind of like a drama and a mystery thriller type of story, but it weirdly works in that comeuppance type of way. And Creepshow is definitely known for asshole comeuppance stories, even though I think Tales from the Crypt is definitely the better franchise for that. Honestly, this kind of played out like how a Tales from the Crypt Keeper episode would play out, just without the inclinations of certain things that happen in it, right? And, it's not as dark as the former story, but it's weirdly more poetic. And I think where the story wraps up is really fun. And I like the build-up in the story of it using the unknown of the parrot to be the source of the tension, because as you get more information about this parrot, it makes you more glued to the page. And that made this story a lot more better to read than the former one. So I had a lot more fun with this one. It could have been way better than it was. It did drag ass at times, but I think I would give this one maybe like a 3.75 out of 5 stars. It's good, just flat good for Creepshow standards. And yeah, I have nothing else to say about that story. So all in all, with both two stories taken into account, honestly, this whole book, I'm not trying to rate this as its own concentric thing, because I like to look at the story separately here. But if I had to say if I thought the book was good, I thought it was pretty good. Kind of, leaning on that lower end, kind of pushing high decent. So as a whole book rating, I give this maybe like a 3.5 out of 5 stars, given both stories into account. One thing I think this book does very well is tones Creepshow down for kids. And this is a great stepping stone for, kids horror fans, or, younger children trying to get into horror, to maybe try, Creepshow out, or just try reading a horror novel dedicated to them, something akin to something like Goosebumps or Are You Afraid of the Dark, and get their, toes a little wet in it. Now, these do feel more synonymous with stuff like The Haunting Hour, you know, if you're familiar with that show from the Hub Network, or from R.L. Stein's short story collection, The Haunting Hour or The Nightmare Hour, which both are sister books. So they are a little bit darker than something like Goosebumps. So if you're a parent out there maybe looking at this book to buy for your kids, there's some dark elements in this that I think would actually freak your kids out, and you might consider them inappropriate, which begs the question, really, to me, my final thought on this is I don't really feel like they had the target audience completely nailed for this. I know the back it says ireadya.com, but young adult isn't the age of 13, and young adults are not in middle school. So why are middle school kids the purveyors of the story? I don't know. It feels a little bit too dumbed down, and it's not dark enough for like hardcore Creepshow fans to, I think, flat out love this. But it also feels a little too basic and non-creative, or, you know, kind of been there, done that with certain ideas that I think even kids horror aficionados that are well versed in Goosebumps and its knockoffs and Are You Afraid of the Dark and The Haunting Hour and such won't be too impressed by it. So it kind of just, it feels like this book in the stories inside exists. And we'll get to the second one when I get there. I can't remember if I like those two stories significantly more than these two, but you know, we'll get there when we get there, like I said. So yeah, if I had one story that I would recommend to check out over the other, definitely read this book for Pretty Polly. If you want to check out The Taker 2, take the time and read it. I think there's some pretty chilling moments in here for everybody, and I think even you know, hardcore Creepshow guys can appreciate some of the darker takes they took here, given that this book was made for kids after all. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Creepshow, The Taker, in terms of the stories, The Taker and Pretty Polly. Let me know down in the comment section if you read this book or one or both of the stories inside. What did you think of them? Did you love them? Did you hate it? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.